Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 111, The Seleucid Empire, the Elephant in the Throne Room. The death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in November of 164 while on campaign in Iran left the Seleucid realm in a precarious state. He was in the middle of re-establishing his authority in the upper satrapies, but this mission ended in failure upon his death. An heir was in place, the 10-year-old Antiochus V, who had been elevated to the status of co-ruler just before his father's departure for the east. But the responsibility for administering the realm was left to the standing regent Lysias. It was this minister who bestowed the younger Antiochus with the epithet Eupator, of a noble father, an obvious attempt to emphasize his connection with his sire given his very young age. The few portraits we have of Eupator do little to hide the king's obvious youth, so some other means was needed to strengthen his legitimacy. Unfortunately, his accession was anything but simple. According to cuneiform documents, Epiphanes' body was brought back to Babylon between December 19th of 164 and January the 16th of 163, accompanied by a commander named Philip. The Jewish sources claim that, on the king's deathbed, Philip was appointed as the standing regent by Antiochus, entrusted with the royal signet ring and diadem, and tasked to protect the interest of his son. It is extremely unlikely that Epiphanes would engineer a situation contrary to his own arrangement that would directly lead to a civil war, but Philip was now intent on establishing himself as the new head of government. This is likely the reason why Lysias had retired from Judea so suddenly after the engagement at Beth-Zachariah with Judas Maccabee, as news of both the king's death and Philip's claims would have stirred up trouble in Antioch. These problems would have plagued the kingdom for quite some time, and this apparent weakness allowed unhappy locals to express their frustration. Cuneiform documents also speak of the local communities of Babylon battling against the governor in October of 163, along with the Greeks of the Politai who settled there a few years earlier, though whether it was tied to the reforms instituted in the city by Antiochus IV or a negative response to Philip is unclear. This is nothing to say of the Maccabean Revolt. When we last left Judea, Judas Maccabee entered Jerusalem and refounded the temple in an elaborate display to cleanse the sanctuary of any pollution. However, the high priest Menelaus and the Seleucid garrison remained within the Acra, which was heavily fortified and a reminder that the king's representatives still had a strong presence. Though the troubles of the empire would keep him occupied for the time being, Lysias would inevitably return to finish the job that he started. Our chronology is once again muddled, so I'm going to attempt to reconstruct these events as best as I can. Throughout the winter of 164-163, Lysias may have returned to Antioch to organize the official coronation of Antiochus V and wait for the possible confrontation with Philip. By the end of January 163, Philip was still in Mesopotamia, but Lysias felt insecure about his position and sought to better shape the government to his liking. Ptolemy Macron, the strategos of Coeli Syria, who advocated mediation with the rebellious Jews, was pressured to commit suicide after being accused of holding traitorous intentions, though it was more likely that Lysias saw him as a dangerous political rival. Judas meanwhile ordered that the areas surrounding the temple be fortified, along with the garrison at Beth-Zachariah, lest a Seleucid force try to attack them from the south. With Lysias and Antiochus tied up with the troubles in the empire, Judas was comfortable enough to conduct a number of campaigns against his neighboring regions. First was against the Idumeans, who were still loyal to the Seleucids and contributed troops to the earlier expeditions against the Maccabees. After this raid, Judas's army headed east across the Jordan River to confront a Seleucid governor named Timotheus, who gathered a force to try and drive back the rebels. Across several skirmishes, he managed to finally defeat Timotheus, capturing the settlement of Jazara about 20 kilometers northwest of Philadelphia, before retiring back to Judea. Here we are told that the Maccabees received letters from the Jews living in the lands north of Philadelphia, the Galilee, and southern Syria, claiming that the Gentiles of Ptolemais Akko, Tyre, and Sidon conspired to destroy them. The writers of these letters begged Judas to come to their defense, and so he divided the responsibility between himself and his brother Simon to rescue their fellow Jews in separate missions, but the circumstances surrounding this are highly questionable. The description of the Maccabees' subsequent attacks against the cities of Phoenicia are filled with contradictions and several dubious claims, namely their sudden ability to take heavily fortified Greek cities despite lacking the proper siege equipment. And it might be likely that these written accounts were influenced by the later Hasmoneans, who held imperialistic claims over these regions. From what we can confirm, the Maccabees conducted raids against settlements, successfully battled with local Seleucid officials like Timotheus and Gorgias, the governor Idumea, and returned to Jerusalem with captives and loot taken from any captured towns, along with recruits that could be drawn from the Jewish communities in those regions. These expeditions ate up most of 163 and probably concluded at the end of summer. But Judas realized that if the walls of the Acra still stood, he could never fully claim control over Jerusalem, and his position was aggravated by the raids against stray Maccabean forces by the garrison inside. Thus, he set about putting the citadel under siege through the winter of 163-162. During that time, several Hellenizers managed to escape undetected and returned to the court of Eupator, asking for assistance to defend against the Maccabees. The would-be usurper Philip was presumably still tied up in Mesopotamia, so Lysias and Antiochus could gather an army of sufficient size to confront the rebels without compromising their eastern frontier, though probably nowhere near as much as the 120,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry as the Jewish accounts claim. As he had done before, Lysias led the troops south along the coastline and swung back up through Idumea, where he besieged the recently fortified Beth-Zur. Though the defenders gave a valiant effort, it proved to be too much, as they could not stand against the Seleucid war machine nor traitorous elements within the Maccabean camp. Judas left Jerusalem with as much men as he could muster in order to confront the advancing army of the regent, encamping near the site of Beth-Zachariah, roughly 20 kilometers to the southwest of the city. Here the pass is narrow and could impede the strength of the Seleucid numbers, which probably were somewhere around 50,000 infantry and 5,000 riders, along with a handful of war elephants. Lysias organized the troops into individual formations of 1,000-foot soldiers and 500 cavalry, attached to a single elephant, which would enable them to pass through the terrain more effectively. As they marched through the pass, the Seleucid soldiers slammed their weapons against their shields and raised a great war cry, echoing against the walls of the valley to frighten any would-be attackers. Judas and his men lay in wait, and shortly afterwards engaged with the Syrian army. Earlier, Lysias deployed lighter infantry to seize the ridges of the valley, which prevented the Maccabees from effectively ambushing them from above, and the sights of the bristling phalangites and sounds of the roaring war elephants terrified the rebels. According to tradition, one of Judas's brothers named Eleazar Avaran looked for the largest of the elephants, equipped in armor and its tower bearing shields with royal emblems, and he mistook it for the mount of the boy king Eupator himself. Charging through the phalanx in a mad frenzy armed with only a spear, Eleazar plunged it into the belly of the enormous beast, causing it to topple to the ground and crushing him underneath. Despite his sacrifice, the martyrdom of Eleazar did little to stem the tide, and Judas was forced to lead his army in retreat back to the Gophna Hills. The Battle of Beth-Zachariah was the first serious defeat inflicted against the Maccabean cause, and soon afterwards the Seleucid army returned to Jerusalem once again to restore order. The temple was put under siege, but Lysias was confronted with the distressing news that Philip was finally on the move with an army towards Syria. With Judas and his army hiding out on their home turf, attempting to root them out would be too much of an investment when the stability of the kingdom and his position was at stake. Lysias kept this news a secret from his men, lest he face a mutiny or should they decide to side with Philip, and simply stressed the difficulty of the siege due to the lack of food available from the countryside. Instead of a full-on assault of the city, negotiations were opened with the Maccabean forces stationed in the temple, where a truce was offered. Among the royal correspondence preserved by 2nd Maccabees, one letter by King Antiochus to Lysias detailed the new policy towards the Jews. Quote, King Antiochus to his brother Lysias, greetings. Now that our father has gone on to the gods, we desire that the subjects of the kingdom be undisturbed in caring for their own affairs. We have heard that the Jews do not consent to our fathers' change to Greek customs, but prefer their own way of living, and ask that their own customs be allowed them. Accordingly, since we choose that this nation also should be free from disturbance, our decision is that their temple be restored to them, and that they shall live according to the customs of their ancestors. You will do well, therefore, to send word to them and give them pledges of friendship, so that they may know our policy and be of good cheer, and go on happily in the conduct of their own affairs." End quote. In effect, the crown promised to reverse all the persecutions against the Jewish faith and customs that were put in place during Epiphanes' reign, allowing the Jews to once again worship in their temple. To encourage the arrangement, they decided to sweeten the deal. Sometime in 162, the high priest Menelaus managed to escape the Acra and fled to the court of Eupator seeking refuge, before urging him to destroy the rebellion once and for all. This was blatantly fueled by self-interest in maintaining his station above all else, and both Lysias and Antiochus were deeply annoyed by the high priest, given his role in kickstarting the troubles in Judea to begin with. Lysias suggested that they might want to try and gain the goodwill of the Jews if they were to remove the source of their grievances. Upon Eupator's approval, Menelaus was dragged to Beroea, modern Aleppo, where he was to be executed, ending his 10-year career as a disgraceful high priest. As such, both parties agreed to the terms of the truce. This did not mean that Jerusalem was declared independent, far from it. Before leaving, the regent ordered that the temple's fortified walls be pulled down, which the author of 1st Maccabees believed to be in violation of their agreement, and the Seleucids still claimed ownership over Judea. For now, the question of how to defeat the Maccabees was left for another time, as there were still more pressing matters to attend to. Shortly after departing Judea, Lysias and Antiochus marched upon Antioch, where the usurper Philip had taken control. Some of the armies of the upper satrapies were willing to back Philip's cause to a certain point, but when the legitimate son of Antiochus IV was presented, their support soon collapsed, thus leading to the would-be king's capture and execution. This crisis had been averted, but there was still yet another problem: the Roman Senate. An embassy led by one Gnaeus Octavius was dispatched in 163, tasked with touring most of the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean, such as Alexandria, to investigate the ongoing dispute between Ptolemy VI and VIII, and made a stop in Syria as well in the summer of 162, just after the confrontation with Philip. The outward appearance of the mission was to recognize the enthronement of Antiochus V, but upon meeting with Lysias in the city of Laodicea by the sea, the former consul Octavius instead presented a number of grievances that the Senate had with the Seleucid kingdom, namely their possession of elephants, and the number of warships they had in the harbor. As per the Treaty of Apamea, they were not to have kept any war elephants in their possession, nor exceeded 10 galleys in their navy. Yet the ambassadors could clearly see this was not the case. The deceased Epiphanes even had the audacity to display his beasts in the widely publicized Daphne parade only a few years earlier. In a brutal display of arrogance, Octavius ordered that the warships docked in Laodicea be burned. As for the elephants stationed in Apamea, they were not given a quick death, but instead had their hamstrings cut and forced to die slowly, trumpeting in agony and fear as they bled out to the horror of the Seleucid subjects. One of these bystanders was a resident of Laodicea named Leptines, who was utterly enraged at the sight of these majestic creatures being slaughtered so callously and cruelly that he was reportedly struck by divine inspiration. While Octavius prepared to exercise in the city's gymnasium, Leptines managed to stick a knife between his ribs and assassinated the ambassador. The other Romans were in great danger as well, with the crowd being riled up by the orator Isocrates, who urged that they be lynched to prevent the Senate from finding out about the deed. Lysias likely had to intervene to scuttle the surviving officials to safety, while also protecting Octavius's body from being desecrated. Octavius's murder was gearing up to be a political nightmare for Lysias, who sent envoys back to Rome apologizing profusely for the crimes of the Laodiceans, asserting that neither Eupator nor any of the friends of the king were involved in the plot. Rather than pursuing the matter further and raising hell over the murder of a Roman emissary, the Senate simply dropped the issue and did not press for any punishment or further investigation. Even when the assassin Leptines voluntarily offered to return himself over to Roman custody, he was simply let go on their orders, as was the imprisoned Isocrates. This incident is utterly bizarre, not only for the arrogance of Octavius, but the sharp departure in policy by the Senate, whom Polybius alleged gave the ambassador his mission to check growing Seleucid power. For over 20 years, the Romans did little to actually enforce the terms of the Treaty of Apamea, whether it came to pressing the crown for a late indemnity payment, or preventing them from equipping their armies with elephants. Octavius may very well have just acted of his own accord, and the Senate seemed to realize that he went over the line by letting bygones be bygones. Little good it did for Lysias, who lost the respect of his subjects and his peers for bowing to the Romans in such a humiliating fashion. Though he was able to survive the attempted usurpation of Philip and inflict a defeat on the Maccabees, public opinion had by now turned against the standing regent, as it seems like control of the empire was rapidly slipping away. Antiochus Eupator was still only a child, and it would be some time before he could demonstrate the virtues necessary to take the reins of an increasingly unstable situation. If only there were someone more capable out there to take the throne instead. Enter Demetrius. Born in 192-191, he was the eldest son of Seleucus IV and Laodice IV. He presumably was raised in the court along with his parents, but by 178, his father was compelled to hand him over to the Roman Republic and sent him as a hostage to live in Italy, exchanging places with his uncle Mithridates, and took up residence with his foster father Diodorus for the next 16 years. His name is rather peculiar, since every Seleucid male up to this point had either had the name of Seleucus or Antiochus. Demetrius is attested to with the Antigonids in Macedonia, of which he had a very distant relation, but it is also found among the Euthydemods in Bactria. To my knowledge, there does not seem to be any ideological motivation behind this name being different from his predecessors, but it was worth pointing out. Seleucus died in September of 175. Murdered by the courtier Heliodorus, who was in turn slain by Mithridates a few weeks later when a Pergamene-backed initiative allowed him to usurp the throne of Syria. Given his predicament and age, there was little that Demetrius could do but watch from the sidelines and nurse the hope that one day he might reclaim his lost kingdom. For the time being, he would remain in the vicinity of Rome. Though technically a hostage, he was given considerable freedom to roam of his own accord, spending his time in the Italian countryside on hunting expeditions, and was quite fond of day drinking. Along with Diodorus, he found companionship with other exiles from the Seleucid kingdom, those like his foster brother Apollonius and his siblings, who were the sons of a prominent official that was driven out when Epiphanes took the throne. As Roman authority grew and its behavior became harsher, the city saw the arrival of new hostages and visitors. One of these was Polybius of Megalopolis, brought to Italy alongside other Achaeans in the aftermath of the war against King Perseus. He became attached to the household of Aemilius Paulus, but also formed a friendship with Demetrius and frequently joined him on his hunts. Another prominent figure he encountered was his cousin, Ptolemy VI Philometor. Riding about 40 miles outside of Rome, Demetrius found and recognized the king of Egypt walking along the Appian Way with his attendants, but Philometor appeared less than regal since he had been forced to flee Alexandria due to the schemes of Ptolemy VIII in late 164. There was no love lost between them, but the sight of a fellow monarch dressed in rags and accompanied only by a few slaves was enough for Demetrius to extend an olive branch, generously offering to provide Ptolemy with a new royal costume, diadem, and horse, as more befitting of a man of his station. The offer was politely refused, since Philometor had his own purpose for his choice of garb, but this was not the last time the two would cross paths. Yet by the end of 163, the situation had radically changed. Demetrius had been keeping tabs on Syria, and upon the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, he requested that he be allowed to return to claim the throne. He spoke to the Senate of how his uncle was a usurper, and by extension his cousin Eupator was no better, whereas he held the legitimate right of succession from his father Seleucus. They also need not question his loyalty. Demetrius expounded on how Rome was his fatherland and his nurse, that the sons of the senators were all like brothers to him, and the senators themselves like fathers. Though they were genuinely moved, the Senate denied the request and assigned the mission of Gnaeus Octavius to approve the enthronement of Eupator. Following the murder of Octavius and the apologetic embassy of Lysias in mid-162, Demetrius believed that the kingdom's subjects had turned against the standing regent, and that now was the time to make his bid. Before he did anything, he consulted Polybius, who cautioned him against making the Senate aware of his intentions. Our Achaean companion was greatly suspect of the Republic's motives, as he believed that the Senate deliberately wanted a child on the Syrian throne because they wished to keep the kingdom weak, rather than having someone more age-appropriate to take the helm. We saw similar accusations thrown when it came to their role in arbitrating the dispute between Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII, but it seems like this was born out of his own ties of friendship rather than a deliberate maliciousness on the Senate's part. Polybius was more than willing to approve the Senate's actions against someone like Antiochus IV, yet is a much harsher critic when it came to his friends like Demetrius or even Ptolemy VI. What is consistent with the Senate's policy towards the Greek East is promoting stability above all else, and in this case it was no different. Throwing a wild card like Demetrius into the kingdom, which was already attempting to deal with usurpers like Philip and the Maccabean Revolt, would have only caused further chaos in the region. Coming from another angle, it's surprising that the Senate didn't end up championing Demetrius as a new king, considering that he had held such close ties to the Roman aristocracy. If we look at the imperial policy of Augustus and later emperors, it was common practice to raise foreign-born princes within Rome, in the hopes of fostering loyalty before they returned to rule over their kingdoms. Yet in this case, they thought that Eupator was the legitimate king, despite the potential advantages that installing a loyal monarch in Antioch might bring. Nevertheless, Polybius' prediction turned out to be correct, as Demetrius' request was denied yet again when he brought it to the Senate floor. Yet all was not lost, for his foster father Diodorus returned from Syria reporting that the tensions between Lysias and the kingdom's subjects were at an all-time high, and if a challenger like Demetrius showed up accompanied only by a single slave, they would gladly salute him as king. It also seemed unlikely that the Senate would jump to Lysias' defense, given the situation with Octavius, and so a decision needed to be made. The prince relayed his desires to Polybius, who arranged for a secret meeting between Demetrius, himself, and Menelaus of Alabanda, an official of Ptolemy VI who was in Rome at the time on his king's behalf, and a longtime friend of the Achaean historian. The trio planned for Demetrius' escape. A Carthaginian ship loaded with goods destined for Tyre would be prepared to depart near the mouth of the Tiber at Ostia, while he along with his entourage would rendezvous with Menelaus and sail off in the cover of night. Diodorus was sent to Syria to prepare for the prince's eventual arrival, and in the meanwhile an alibi was needed. Excusing himself from a dinner party on account of illness, Demetrius ordered his companions to have their slaves go to the Italian countryside with nets and dogs in the morning, under the premise that he planned on venturing out to his usual hunting grounds. Equipped in their traveling clothes, Demetrius and his men met with Menelaus in Ostia, and with his blessing, sailed away with none the wiser. It took nearly 4 days for a search party to be sent, and the exasperated Senate decided not to pursue matters further, since Demetrius' ship was already well past the Straits of Messina. In the autumn of 162, Demetrius made landfall in Tripolis in Phoenicia, put the diadem upon his head, and, as Diodorus predicted, the Syrians quickly went over to his side. Word spread that the son of Seleucus had returned, and Demetrius was able to enter Antioch and was immediately acclaimed by officers of the army. Eupator and Lysias had promptly been arrested shortly before his arrival, so they could be brought in front of him, but the new ruler simply ordered that he did not wish to see their faces. And so, both the minister and boy king were executed in one fell swoop, the latter dying at age 12 after a mere 2 years on the throne. It is rather poetic that the destruction of the elephants at Apamea by Octavius and the martyrdom of Eleazar against the war elephant occurred so shortly apart from one another. The association of the elephant as being a distinctively Seleucid symbol is well known, and in this case we might see this as an unintentional metaphor for the dynasty's eroding authority both within and outside of the empire. The circumstances of Antiochus Epiphanes' rise to power reared its ugly consequences with Eupator's murder, and while Demetrius was now the master of Syria, it would not be uncontested.